Okay, Janice, back to you.
Okay, so in terms of parking lot, there are a number of issues as I see it that surfaced, and some of those are taken from the discussion. Some of them are taken from the chats that I received. So I'm thinking that we can kind of hit the main points. I'd like to also hit some of the specific questions of the speakers. But it seemed like to me from your comments and questions that one of the major themes was, taken from Dawn's presentation, how we use stories and then operationalize those to help implement change on the micro level, and also the meso level, and then with organizations reaching up to policy, how we use those. Also, in terms of data, one of the issues would be what are the best ways to gauge juvenile crime trends in the future? I mean, how do we look at the judicial system in terms of arrests? How do we figure that in terms of gauging future trends? There's a couple of more, but maybe we should stop there and throw those out for discussion. Comments? Anybody want to comment first on the narrative piece? Yeah. Hello. Kathy.
I just am going to throw this out there. I wrote it down when in the talking about the narratives and the stories is the old idea of Chautauqua. I don't know if that word just came to me. In my years of working with prevention and SAD in this high school, students against destructive decisions, one part of our thing, and probably most of the schools have speakers come in. And the most effective speakers we've had were people who came and shared their own stories because they became impassioned to come and speak, whatever their story was about, getting involved in crime, getting involved in drugs, whatever, they would share from the heart their own stories as we saw here today. And that is the most powerful connection. And I have literally seen lives changed at a school assembly in a gymnasium. And one of the most moving experiences was the classmate of one of my children, after hearing this impassioned talk, it was about bullying, stood up and said, I've been bullied all my life. I'm not going to take it anymore. That young man changed his life, went into a life of service, and still lives a life of public service that was absolutely inspiring. So I know the power of those stories. And I just am throwing out there the idea of a Chautauqua, assembling people who have stories, who have, I'm saying in Oakley, we have a wonderful drama coach, for example, that does just a fabulous job with her students. I'm just brainstorming a Chautauqua group that could maybe travel and share a series of stories in communities, people who have something to present. So Siri thought I was talking to her. I wasn't. But to share their stories anyway, just throwing that out there, just the word Chautauqua.
Well, sure. I mean, that's implementation at not only a micro individual level, but a community level as well. Okay. Other thoughts about this?
We have another question from Linda.
Okay. Let's see if I have.
Hi, I'm Linda Davis Stevens. I do volunteer work with the Thomas County Historical Society in Colby. It's the Prairie Museum. So in June, every year for many years, we've had a youth Chautauqua. Maybe some of you have attended or heard of it, but you can start them in your own area. We had training from the people who did Chautauqua years ago, so that for a whole week, the youth can come to the museum every afternoon, 10-year-olds up through adult, and they study history in Thomas County and take on a character from the history of Thomas County and portray in 5 minutes something in that first person character. So it could be helpful if youth realize that they're not just having these problems to overcome, or critical thinking that they have to do now has also been done for 100 years and more. And it's very effective, but we have usually about an hour performance on Friday. They've turned it into a matinee and an evening performance where these youth then get to talk in character for an hour of about 10 or 11 people. So that was to follow up on what Kathy said, that it's not exactly preventive, but it gives them a chance to step out of their lives and step into a persona that they might not have realized has already been in the past.
Well, and related to that, let's realize that over time, we've lost some of the arts and humanities in schools with budget cuts. So there used to be ways for, if not sports, other ways to find self-expression. And this example is a good way that maybe used to have formats to do that we don't have like we used to.
So Dawn, you suggested in your talk to us that stories are also used as you're also used as part of the data that you study. So how do you go about that?
There's a couple of projects I've been working on. One is I've have interviews with police officers, and so I've published a couple areas that looked at organizational narratives, and I actually looked at them and how officers start to shape their behavior in their environment. So when I was doing my dissertation, I was actually interested in gendered elements of policing. It's a profession that still is very male-centric and masculine-driven. The last data I have is something around 14% of sworn police officers are women. But when I started doing my interviews, that's where I was curious. What came up over and over was the idea of stories. And I asked officers how they interacted with each other. And it's like, oh, we tell these same stories. We tell war stories, off duty, on duty. And then it started to reflect on my own work that a lot of how when I used to describe what I did was about the stories I told. And so that's when I first got introduced into sort of narrative analysis. And then I thought that, well, that shapes the identity of an organization to share stories. That what's interesting in law enforcement is it collapses large segments of the job that are not really talked about into packaged narratives that can travel. Law enforcement is also influenced because our popular culture is full of police stories, movies, dramas, pulp fiction, and all those things actually shape officers before they arrive. So it's really this dialectical process. So that's just one element. But then I think, well, we're all sort of like that it's a dialectical process. We have our identity that's internal to ourselves, but we know that's shaped by our interactions with people and how we interact with our families and in our schools. And just related to that too, there were studies, and I can't cite them right now, so I could be a little bit off, but it looked at how the idea of a child's abilities followed from one teacher to another at a very young age, so that kindergarten and first grade have a dramatic impact on how they're defined, and then it becomes limiting the sort of courses they're allowed. And so that's narrative. There's data there, right? But there's a narrative that processes beyond data. And we know this with juvenile justice, right? Some kids can do a pretty horrific crime, but there's a narrative about them that's, well, no, wait a minute, this was an aberration. This was a singular event. Whereas other children get completely defined and they're internal. The opposition defiant kid I gave as an example, that kid was not opposition defiant. He was angry as hell because of his situation. And so it's interesting how much of it can be external and internal and how we work with those processes. And then as the comments people gave, do we even allow space for those to develop? So I guess that's how I got interested in narrative, and a project that's kind of been more difficult, but I was actually interested in, there's a Kansas Historical Society has the data sets on everybody's name who went to prison. going back to 1890s. So what I wanted to start doing, and I haven't quite got there, was to find the existing families of somebody who went to prison in the 1890s, 1910s, and see how this intergenerationally shaped their family identity. Now that is a long scale project, and I haven't quite gotten there, but it would just be fascinating to see either how they reflect the identity because of this family idea or how they reshape their identity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. Any more comments related to what Don just said?
You know, I have to give an example that happened in infancy. When my son was born, he decided that he wasn't going to nurse for over 24 hours. Had I not been in the hospital with doctors and nurses helping me, I would have given up. On his chart, they wrote that he was stubborn. This is a newborn infant.
Yeah.
He wrote that on his chart. As he got older, we had a lot of problems with colicky kind of stuff that now, if you have that happen, they call it acid reflux. I've learned that from my grandchildren. And I could not get doctors to listen to me because they had written on his chart that this was a stubborn baby. Now, the reality is he is stubborn, but that didn't dismiss the fact that this story that got told about him, it probably took me, I would say, 4 or 5 sessions with the doctor to get him to really look what was going on with him digestively so we could make adjustments that helped him. So that power of story is amazing.
Well, and this is a sense where that narrative gets developed. So if you hear stories of, oh, you're stubborn, you start to develop your identity around that and then become stubborn. I mean, it's not as simplistic as that, but I think that's a great example of something that predates sort of the consciousness of a child, but gets shaped. Now think about children removed from home, children defined by schools or community, you know, with limited resources to change that identity, and that identity is in fact negative in some ways. And that's the stuff that I'm really interested in.
Another question for you, but before I move on to one for Ann, since Dawn, we're kind of spotlighting you right now. A question, and I think it was, everybody can see it. What would you attribute the dramatic decrease in youth arrests since the 90s? And it kind of goes along with the best way to gauge juvenile justice crime trends. What's the best way? Or we look at, you look at arrests. How does that all relate? A stacking question.
Well, this is always a difficult.
Not to do that.
Yeah, this is in some ways a difficult question. Oh, my internet's fading. Hold on. I can press and make it look like the internet's fading when I have a tough question.
John, let me interrupt you. I need to go back to Ann because she's got to leave at 11:35. I'm just being told. So we had a question about what you mean. Whoops. Could you talk more about the individual reports you put out for local communities and how that works?
Yeah, so a community can reach out to us and ask for specific, they want to know something specific about their program type. When they do that, we generally try to reach out to the Crime Commission and then make sure that nobody's feeling left out. When you're working with 200 programs, we have to sometimes juggle. But usually programs are happy to learn from one another. And so if I have one program that steps forward and requests an evaluation, we shouldn't have any problem moving forward with that unless it demands a lot of our resources. And then we just have to be equitable. But usually, like I said, the Nebraska communities have been really good about kind of learning from each other and seeing where we're different, like if we have different types of interventions. So I've been really excited that our communities, you always worry if you spotlight one program, maybe somebody feels left out or jealous, but that hasn't been the demeanor at all over the last 4 years or so. It's been really compatible. No. And I'm sorry I have to leave a few minutes early. We just have juggling so many things in this household today. But the other thing I just wanted to speak a little bit about. I hope my experience has been unique, but sometimes I study race and ethnicity. And so I did, I think I actually worked on Kansas's DMC study, and we did Nebraska's DMC study. And unfortunately, one of the things we saw with arrests is when we reported in a particular county that there was a lot of overrepresentation of Native youth. In the subsequent 2 years, what we saw is they stopped reporting arrests in that community, even though they're required under law to report that to our crime commission. So I think sometimes just numbers can be misleading, but then I do think we're seeing a decline in juvenile crime. I think I worry sometimes, is it what we're capturing or is it what's really happening? So I can turn it back to Dawn, because I think the question was for you, Dawn.
Well, I think we should bring Sue in on this one as well, since she's a criminologist. It's a tough question to answer. If you go back to the 90s, everybody thought it was going to explode, and it did the exact opposite. But I do agree that arrest is so imperfect for so many reasons. But they are, as you can see, the trends in the data. But I also think the reality is, in some ways we used the system more than we used to. One of my other first jobs was a juvenile intake officer in the late 90s. And I remember 2 12-year-olds got arrested, brought through our juvenile intake system and charged with battery for a school bus fight. And certainly in the 80s, they would have never been processed through the system. They would have been suspended from school and likely from riding the bus. So that makes it even more complex, that I do think. And if you look at trends of school resource officers, a friend, Travis Linham, and I decided we were going to do some geo, back when playing around with data, geo tracking of where the arrest occurred in Manhattan. And what we discovered, there was only 2 places: the high school, really, and the mall, so shoplifting and Walmart. And part of that, you discover, until there was a school resource officer, arrest didn't really occur in the school either. They just now use that as a clearinghouse to serve any warrants, or there were more likely to be arrests for elements. So yeah, that's tricky. Sue, trends?
Well, one of the interesting, so yeah, all of the data show that juvenile crime is down, but it also mirrors the downward turn of overall crime. Yeah. So there, anytime you're talking about something as complex as human beings and human interaction, and that's what crime is, then it's never just one thing. There's a lot that has to do with economic trends and kinds of unemployment and poverty and that sort of thing. But it also varies from place to place to place. So I always teach my students, if anyone tells you it's this A, B, or C, then be very suspicious, because it's never just one thing. The interesting question, though, is, I think, as crime has gone down, incarceration, including juvenile incarceration until just recently, has gone up. So that just doesn't make sense. And it does fit in with some of the trends, including the narratives and the overall use of the system that has really conflicted and brought about a lot of confusion. So until we can sort of sort all of that out, I don't think we'll have a very good answer to that. But it's encouraging to see that now we are beginning to sort of bend that curve again toward more rehabilitative measures and away from incarceration, and especially from taking those kids out of the home. Now, having said that, as we very well know in this project and with OTOK, that is not without problems either. And that's what we're facing with SB 367, that it's not spread, the results, the outcomes are not spread like an even blanket even across Kansas. And we've run into that in Western Kansas, and we're trying to inform policymakers about the nuances that all communities, all places, all demographics are not equal in terms of how we can handle sort of a one-size-fits-all model. So that's at the heart of what we're trying to do here at OTOK, is to look at some of the nuances and the ways in which different communities are affected differently by one policy that tries to sort of be a be all end all. We need to sort of somehow figure out how to build in contingencies. And sometimes it comes right back to resources. So hopefully we can figure out how to talk about equity instead of equality, if that makes sense. That's probably a sort of a longer discussion, but sometimes we have to spend more in one area. It reminds me of Dawn's story about the judge. Sometimes we have to have what appears to be unequal treatment to get an equitable outcome. And that gets really complicated and hard to figure out how to use. I was glad to hear Ann talk about the DMC work. That's how I first met Brock Lindwehr, was in, I guess, 15 years ago, Brock, when we worked with the DMC groups and a pilot project in Raleigh County and some across the state as well. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about next week. It's a hard topic and one that I hope you join us in. And Katrina Pollitt is going to be key to that one. She has things to say. I'm pretty sure about that. And Mary is going to also talk about the data. It's really exciting to get to bring these voices together to get it all out on the table. Once we can get it out on the table, then I think we can begin to address those complexities and begin to disentangle them to some extent. So, yeah, it's complicated.
Janice, you're muted. You had a question from Callie.
Yes, we do. She and I have been communicating. Callie?
Well, I actually, it was more of a comment, but now that they're not going to be combining the agencies. But as far as the arrest data for juveniles not always being the best way to gauge juvenile trends, and it's not a clear picture because like what they do in Tribune, Kansas versus what they do in Garden City is quite different. It's because there's difference in resources. And Judge Dixon's on, and they've been doing it in Tribune for quite a few years, where they have a group of people that meet at the school, and they've done it for years. And if you'll look at their arrest data and you look over it over a trends, it doesn't mean there's not juvenile offenders in Tribune or Tribune, Kansas. It means on how they've been able to adjust to it. And that's been going on for, he's kind of young, so just a few years. But you can't just go on the arrest data to look at what's going on for juveniles, and to throw in for us in Western Kansas, we don't all speak English. And I don't see that being addressed across as far as the equity issue throughout the system. I have some experience with working with juvenile offenders and their families, and when they're worried about how to keep the lights on and all of those things, and it becomes a safety issue and things like that, there's a quite difference between a juvenile offender and a child in need of care case. And so I feel like going back 20 years, what they've done in the state of Kansas has been detrimental to kids and families. And so I hope that OTOK has looked at some of those data, because if you go back and look at 5 years ago, 7 years ago, and look at some of the programs that were in the state then that are not now, and look at recidivism rates, you will see a difference.
Yeah, and to add to that, oftentimes the underlying issue would be a child needed care issue, but because they had a juvenile offense, they would go over to the juvenile offender side. And I can tell you, when I was practicing the system, when they reached the end of the juvenile offender side, it was hard to get back to the child need care side. It had often become a battle because part of the system was also structured to where it probably wasn't beneficial for one of the contract providers to take the case back on at that point. And so it very, very complicated how much those two elements intermingle in a child's life.
Yeah, and listening to their stories, you can quickly tell a difference between a kid that was a child in need of care that turned juvenile offender, or a kid that was never a child in need of care and was only a juvenile offender. There's a quick difference in them.
Yeah.
Janice, you're muted.
I know. Anybody else in response to any of those issues or ones that you feel important that came up today that we haven't been able to discuss? Okay. Sue, I'm going to turn it back over to you at this point.
All right, thank you so much, coordinators. Thank you for everyone attending. I really look forward to next week. We're going to pick up, you'll be surprised. You notice we had some really smooth transitions. We planned that, right? No, actually, it's because all of these things are intertwined, and I applaud the presenters and the participants as well for recognizing those connections. So it's going to seem next week that we reflected on this week and maybe extended the conversation. And again, we've been working on these programming for a long time, and it's really interesting how it begins to all come together in one conversation, and that's because you've participated, you've shown up, and I'm eternally grateful for that. You make OTOK what it is, and we want to take advantage of that at every opportunity. So we will see you next week. Let us know. You will receive the invitation again, but you'll use the same link, actually. And if you know someone that you think should be in on this conversation and you think has not had the opportunity to do so, then please let us know and we can consider inviting them in, okay? Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe. Stay healthy, save lives. Bye-bye, everybody.